said about other people, or I've said about other people today, been accurate? 10% accurate? 60% accurate? Or do I not value truth? And so it goes on. This is a huge challenge, but it's showing the secret of standing. If you've got no sense of God covering your history, you'll wobble and fall. If you've got no sense of God being your supreme value, the same thing is going to happen. You're going to be wiped away in a society that is desperate to take what's most precious from you and destroy your value system. And then in chapter 3, he makes a golden image. And the three friends are ordered to bow down to the image. Now watch what's happening. In chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar relativizes the absolute. In chapter 3, he absolutizes the relative. That's what happens. You see, you can't live without absolutes. And if you take the true absolute of God and relativize him, in the end, you'll take something else and make an absolute out of it. Either it'll be money, sex, or power. And here it's the state. And so Nebuchadnezzar builds this huge golden, very valuable statue and says to men, you bow down to that. How would you have faced that? How would I have faced that? I've often thought of one of these men, now older, owning a palace with a job for life, with huge reserves of money in the bank. And suddenly Nebuchadnezzar announces to them that the following week he will expect them all to be down in the square at the town. And they will bow when the state symphony orchestra starts to play. They will bow to his image. Imagine going home to your wife and saying, I've got something to say to you. What is it, dear? You look a bit sad. Well, I am. Nebuchadnezzar has ordered us next week to come and bow down to a statue that he has erected. And it's just a statue of his God. Well, what's the big deal? I'm not going to do it. You're what? But what's going to happen? He's erected a furnace. Anybody that doesn't do it will be burned. But my husband, what about me? What about the children? I mean, haven't you taught us that there's nothing in these gods? And it's a huge sea of people. Nobody will know. If you've got no sense of God covering your history, you'll wobble and fall. If you've got no sense of God being your supreme value, the same thing is going to happen. You're going to be wiped away in a society that is desperate to take what's most precious from you and destroy your value system. Well, thank you so very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all in Norway. I'm going to talk to you about a person who lived in 600 or so BC, so around 25 centuries ago. Why should we be interested? Well, there are several reasons. First of all, the main part of what I'm going to say is about Daniel as a young person and what he experienced essentially as a teenager, let's say between he was 15 and he was 20. He lived in a very narrow culture for the first part of his life. It was a monotheistic culture. It was a Jewish culture. And then suddenly, virtually overnight, he was taken by force many kilometers away to a completely different culture. The language was totally different. The legal system was totally different. The economic system was completely different. And so it goes on. It was a very powerful culture. And we can think of that and ask ourselves, why should it be important for us as young people in the 21st century to think about it at all? Now, I want to come to the central point right away, and it's this. Daniel was brought up in a God-fearing environment, that's clear. To the end of his life, he maintained devotion to God. It's clear that he prayed and he read his Bible. And that's very good. But there's something else he kept doing. You see, I've lived long enough to notice many people who still read their Bible. They go to church. They say their prayers. But long ago, they have lost the cutting edge of their public witness. They've been silenced by secular culture. Many of them have got scared, so that their Christianity is done in private, either in the box that is their house or the box that is their church. And for years, they've never let other people know that they've been a Christian, that they are one. And what amazes me about this man, Daniel, and his three friends, is they did not simply maintain their devotion to God, but they maintained their witness. And so we're going to have a look and ask the question, Daniel, tell us, what was it kept you standing straight in public for all of your life, standing as a believer in God? Now, I say that he moved.
In the dialogue above, the speaker argues that without a transcendent reference point grounding both history and personal value, individuals inevitably lose stability, and I find this argument philosophically persuasive. Human identity cannot sustain itself on purely social or psychological foundations. When history is reduced to blind process and value is reduced to preference, meaning becomes fragile. I agree with the speaker because societies that remove God as the ultimate horizon must still function on values, but those values become vulnerable to manipulation by power, culture, or ideology. The result is not neutrality, but erosion. This is not a story of gradual cultural exchange, but of abrupt immersion. Daniel is not negotiating identity from a safe distance. He is forced into the heart of a system that is linguistically, legally, and economically alien. I agree with the speaker because this mirrors the modern experience of young believers who find themselves suddenly surrounded by a worldview far more confident, sophisticated, and institutionally powerful than their inherited faith. Private belief without public consequence transforms faith into a lifestyle accessory rather than a truth claim. I agree with the speaker because a belief system that claims ultimate truth cannot coherently accept permanent silence in the public square. When faith is restricted to private boxes, home and church, it ceases to shape conscience, culture, or courage. Daniel's significance lies not in private piety alone, but in visible allegiance under pressure. The opening section establishes a foundational diagnosis. Modern societies do not primarily reject faith through argument, but through marginalization. By allowing belief only in private, secular culture reframes religion as irrelevant rather than false. Daniel's story confronts this move directly. His faith is not remarkable because it survives inwardly, but because it remains visible outwardly. The crisis, then and now, is not disbelief, but the quiet erosion of public conviction. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.
To the culture of Babylon, and I want you to get some idea of this, because Babylon was a spectacular city. It was the most swinging city in the world at the time. Babylon was advanced in music. It was advanced in art. It was advanced in engineering. It was light years ahead of Jerusalem. So you've got to think about these four young people coming to Babylon forcibly, but suddenly finding themselves enrolled in the top course in King's College Babylon, the university. And we're going to follow them there. Now, the Babylonians were brilliant people, and they developed language to a high degree. And one of the very interesting things about the book of Daniel is that it is written in two languages. There's Hebrew and Aramaic. Starts off in Hebrew, moves to Aramaic, and goes back to Hebrew. And what I think about it is this. Aramaic was the cultural language in Babylon of the day. Now, put together with that the fact that the book of Daniel is not all written by Daniel. Chapter 4 starts with the words, I, Nebuchadnezzar. He was the emperor. So perhaps with Daniel's help, he wrote the 4th chapter. And it is a remarkable testimony of how God came to Nebuchadnezzar's attention, and he came to believe, at least to a certain extent, in Daniel's God. That was the effect of Daniel's witness, and we look at it more carefully. But I just want you to get the broad facts before we go into the details. So the emperor comes to believe in God and writes about it in a language everybody could understand. So there is a sense in which the book of Daniel is the first evangelistic tract in the whole of history. And Daniel talks about
In the dialogue above, the speaker presents Babylon as a culturally and technologically superior civilization, and I find this depiction historically accurate and strategically important to the argument. The challenge Daniel faces is not crude oppression, but sophisticated excellence. Babylon does not threaten faith through barbarism, but through brilliance. I agree with the speaker because advanced culture often disarms moral resistance. When a civilization excels in art, science, and organization, it gains persuasive authority. Faith, in such a context, risks appearing intellectually provincial unless it possesses deeper foundations. Education shapes imagination before it shapes conclusions. I agree with the speaker because the most effective form of cultural domination is not censorship, but formation. By educating Daniel and his friends at the highest level, Babylon sought not merely their compliance, but their intellectual assimilation. This mirrors modern secular institutions that integrate belief-tolerant language while quietly reshaping ultimate loyalties. Language determines reach. I agree with the speaker because the shift from Hebrew to Aramaic signifies intentional public engagement, not religious retreat. The message of God enters the dominant cultural medium rather than remaining confined to sacred subcultures. This undermines the assumption that faith must withdraw when facing imperial power. Instead, Daniel demonstrates that faithful presence can redirect the voice of authority itself. This section exposes a critical insight. The greatest threat to faith is not persecution, but prestige. Babylon does not seek to silence Daniel. It seeks to absorb him. Cultural excellence, intellectual sophistication, and elite education become tools of quiet assimilation. Yet Daniel's witness proves that engagement with dominant culture need not result in surrender. When faith possesses internal coherence and moral clarity, it can operate within powerful systems without losing its identity. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.
About the future to his day, that is the future in the 2nd century BC, in the time of the Greeks, and he gets it so accurately right that many people say, well, of course, Daniel didn't live when he claims he lived. He lived 400 years later, and there's no such thing as predicting the future in the biblical sense. So this faces us with a hugely important question today. As you know, I'm a mathematician. I work in the sciences. And one of the biggest objections to the whole of the Christian faith and the biblical revelation that I meet from people is, look, you cannot possibly believe this stuff. Because the central claim of Christianity to start with, that God became human, that is supernatural. And the supernatural doesn't happen. And this book of Daniel, he claims to predict the future. Don't be ridiculous. This is not possible. No one can know history in advance. Well, we shall see. It's good to anchor things in history. And this is the way they wrote newspapers and records in the ancient world. They wrote these cylinders. And these are the Babylonian Chronicles in the British Museum. And this one mentions the capture of Jerusalem in 507 BC. So we've actual historically inscribed cuneiform texts. Cuneos means a wedge. Cuneiform texts recording the events that are in Daniel. These are independent verifications of what is going on. So I'm going to give you the fastest run through Daniel you've ever seen in your lives. So fasten your seatbelts and let's go. Here is a table of contents of the book of Daniel. First of all, the story in the university where he refused the king's food. Secondly, in chapter 2, there's the story of Nebuchadnezzar's terrifying dream of a great image that came crashing down when a stone hit it. And thirdly, Nebuchadnezzar himself built a golden image. The dream had gone to his head. So he built a golden image, and he asked people, including Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to bow to it, and they refused. And then in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, and it's about him again, got very proud. And he was walking on the roof of Babylon, and he said, "Isn't this great Babylon that I built for my glory and my majesty?" And in that moment, he was cut down, exactly in fulfillment of a dream of a tree he'd had that was cut down. And he behaved like an animal, and he ate the grass, and his hair grew long, and his nails grew long for 7 years. And then God restored him. But in the next chapter 5, there's another king, Belshazzar, and he made a mockery of God. And he was mocking God at his banquet, Belshazzar's feast, where he brought the vessels from the temple of God and put them on his table. And a hand came out and wrote on the wall. And that night he was killed. And the empire of Babylon fell. Why that happened, we shall see. So there are 5 stories, one after the other, and they come to a huge climax at Belshazzar's feast and the end of the reign of the Babylonians. Now be careful here. Babylon remained the capital city.
In the dialogue above, the speaker argues that skepticism toward biblical prophecy is driven less by historical evidence than by philosophical presupposition, and I find this critique intellectually sound. The claim that Daniel must have been written later is not derived from manuscript discovery, but from an a priori rejection of supernatural knowledge. I agree with the speaker because the conclusion precedes the investigation. If prophecy is impossible, then accurate prediction must be fraudulent. This is not historical criticism. It is metaphysical exclusion masquerading as scholarship. The rejection of Christianity here is not based on counter-evidence, but on a closed system of explanation. I agree with the speaker because if one begins by asserting that the supernatural cannot occur, then any historical claim involving divine action is dismissed before examination. This is not scientific reasoning. It is an ideological boundary drawn around reality itself. History is not reconstructed from sacred texts alone. I agree with the speaker because cuneiform records provide independent confirmation of Babylonian events described in Daniel. While archaeology does not prove theology, it dismantles the claim that the biblical narrative floats free from historical reality. The text is anchored in verifiable time and place. The book is not a random collection of miracles. I agree with the speaker because its structure reveals a consistent pattern. Private faith leads to public testing, which leads to divine accountability. The fall of Babylon is not merely political, it is moral. History here functions as a theater of values. This section exposes a fundamental conflict between two worldviews. On one side stands a closed naturalistic system that excludes the supernatural by definition. On the other stands a historically grounded faith that invites examination rather than retreat. The debate is not whether Daniel predicts the future, but whether reality itself is open to transcendence. By anchoring theology in history, the narrative of Daniel challenges modern skepticism at its philosophical roots. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.
As we move into chapter 6, because now the governing empire is Medo-Persia, but it's the same capital city. So we have a change of empire. It's like, in a way, Hong Kong was ruled by the British for a while, and now it's gone back to the Chinese. It's the same place, but different rulers. That's what happened here. Incidentally, Daniel is the only person in history of any kind who's ever run two empires. How do you rise to the top of two empires and not only maintain your faith in God, but maintain your witness to God? Well, we shall see. So now we're going to have a look at some detail, in case you're fed up with generalities. So let me read from the beginning of Daniel 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, who seems to have been the dean of students, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, just like at Oxford and Cambridge, which is probably where they got it from. They were to be educated for 3 years. At the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself. When he was a boy in Jerusalem, clearly he had a Jewish background. Presumably he went to synagogue with his father, and he'd heard the prophets. And again the prophets came, first to Israel and then to Judah and Daniel, saying, look, in your culture, you are compromising with the idolatrous interpretation of the universe that the Assyrians and Babylonians hold. You're playing with fire. And what's going to happen, God says, is that if you don't stop, that culture is going to engulf you. They didn't stop. And the culture engulfed them. So Daniel's own captivity, get this, because this is just amazing. His own captivity became evidence to him that God's word was being fulfilled. And our culture, folks, our culture is in huge danger. Each one of you, all of us, do you know you're only 2 clicks away from disaster on the internet? And some of you have been looking at stuff last night that you shouldn't have been. And you know it in your heart. Perhaps it's got a hold of you. That culture, the need to be connected to things that are very questionable. I wonder sometimes, do young people read the lyrics of the songs they buy? I do. And some of them are fearfully anti-God. And yet we think they're lovely tunes. Let's get it straight here. What happened at this time in history was a result of professing believers sinking into compromise with culture, at least secretly. And this generation, this world, this age, we're the most vulnerable because it's so easy to do everything in your own house without being seen. But you're being tracked. You're being tracked. So let's get this lesson, because it's a huge lesson, that when the disaster happened, it actually was evidence that God was behind history. And so Daniel accepted it. That was one of the things that really encouraged Daniel. But now there's something else. I didn't finish the sentence, you see. And this is the very odd thing. Because, you see, what happened was that sentence goes on. And how it goes on is that the Lord gave Jehoiakim into his hand along with some of the vessels from the temple of God. Well, now, if you'd been writing Daniel, would you have put that in? By the way, Nebuchadnezzar took some of the pots and pans out of the temple. What? Now, being a mathematician and a scientist, things that look strange interest me. What on earth is Daniel wasting time talking about Nebuchadnezzar conquering the nation? Well, that was a big thing. And he doesn't say next, and he took me and my friends. No, the next thing he says, he took the vessels. And not only that, he details it. He said he took them into the house of his God, and he put them into the treasury of his God. We need to think about them. Because, you see, Babylon was a brilliant artistic city. If you go to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, you'll see it at the British Museum in London. And in Daniel's day, they reckon there were about 1,137 temples. There were many museums connected with the temples. And as you know, museums in the world are usually full of they're usually full of all kinds of interesting artifacts that have been got from different parts of the world and not always paid for properly. But that's another thing. Well, let that be. But you see, he put these things into a museum. Now, why do you put things in a museum? Not because you don't respect them. The opposite. He valued them to a certain extent. So he put them into the treasure house of his God. And he was naive, like many of these monarchs. And you can just imagine the exhibition marked Jerusalem, and a big glass window and a little notice saying, I, Nebuchadnezzar, overcame this little country on the such and such and so, and here are some of the artifacts. Aren't they beautiful? Aren't I a clever king to overcome a nation like this? And there were dozens of them, from all kinds of nations that he'd conquered. Now, let's ask what he was doing. What does this represent? And here's what it represents. Those vessels made of gold and silver from the temple of God represented absolute value. They were symbols of the glory of God. And to Daniel, they represented absolute value. Nebuchadnezzar made them of relative value. Do you recognize that in your culture? You see, Daniel's explaining to us the big issues. And he's saying, what I noticed in my life was that powerful people and not so powerful people take things of absolute value and they make them of relative value. And our culture is full of it. Because the influence of relativism from the ancient world has been to do exactly this, so people come to the foolish conclusion that there is no absolute truth, that there is no absolute value, that there is no absolute morality. That's very logically silly. Do you like logic? You think of the statement, there is no absolute truth. The person that says it expects you to take it as an absolute truth. So if there's no absolute truth, there's one absolute truth, and that is a contradiction in terms. Everybody believes that there's absolute truth, folks. Only usually not in areas that they think are unimportant. They'll believe in absolute truth about how much they have in the bank, but not about their morality. Now, what is this raising? It's raising the hugely important contemporary question of the relationship between the absolute and the relative. Is that vital to you? Of course it is. Because you have to decide where your values come from. I can imagine Daniel and his friends going down sometimes to the museum in Babylon quietly and going to the window where these lovely vessels were. And Daniel saying, guys, that's what we stand for. There's a Christian version of it. Maybe you've prayed it. Father, hallowed be your name. Your name be separate, be my supreme value. The basic Christian confession is what? Jesus Christ is Lord. He's my Lord. He's my supreme value. Your values are going to be tested tomorrow. How you value truth. Has everything you said
In the dialogue above, the speaker highlights the symbolic significance of the temple vessels as representations of absolute value, and I find this interpretation conceptually strong. Objects gain meaning from what they signify. I agree with the speaker because the vessels are not religious decorations. They embody the holiness and supremacy of God. When these objects are relocated into a pagan treasury, the act is not neutral. It is a declaration that the sacred has been subordinated to imperial power. This is the first step in moral collapse, not denial, but reclassification. Museums do not destroy artifacts, they neutralize them. I agree with the speaker because to admire something aesthetically while stripping it of authority is a subtle form of displacement. God is not mocked or denied here, he is archived. Once the sacred is turned into cultural heritage, it no longer commands obedience. Respect replaces submission, and admiration replaces worship. Relativism cannot sustain its own claims. I agree with the speaker because the assertion there is no absolute truth is itself presented as absolutely true. This is not humility, it is incoherence. Cultures that deny absolutes do not become tolerant. They become selective, enforcing unspoken absolutes through power rather than principle. Values are revealed under pressure, not in theory. I agree with the speaker because Daniel's identity is not anchored in cultural success or political survival, but in what he refuses to reinterpret. The vessels remind him that some things must never be downgraded. When absolute value is lost, identity becomes negotiable and eventually disposable. This section identifies the true mechanism of moral decay, not open rebellion against God, but the quiet transformation of the sacred into the symbolic. By turning absolute value into cultural artifact, Babylon neutralizes truth without appearing hostile. Moral relativism emerges not as freedom, but as contradiction enforced by power. Daniel's resistance is not reactionary, it is rational. He understands that once absolutes are surrendered, nothing remains to protect the human person from being redefined by authority. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion. In the dialogue above, the speaker argues that human beings inevitably orient their lives around some ultimate value, and I find this claim philosophically unavoidable. Human beings cannot live without absolutes. I agree with the speaker because removing God as the supreme value does not eliminate absolutism. It merely relocates it. When transcendence is denied, something finite will inevitably assume ultimate authority. The danger is not that society will have no gods, but that it will choose lesser ones and demand total allegiance. This is not accidental. It is structural. I agree with the speaker because once God is downgraded, power must be upgraded. The state becomes sacred, obedience becomes worship, and dissent becomes heresy. What begins as cultural relativism ends in enforced conformity. History confirms this pattern repeatedly. Moral courage is never abstract. I agree with the speaker because the true weight of conviction appears when obedience costs something real: family security, reputation, even life itself. The temptation here is not atheism, but compromise. Bowing slightly seems reasonable when survival is at stake. That is precisely why the test is decisive. This is not transactional belief. I agree with the speaker because genuine faith does not hinge on guaranteed rescue. The refusal to bow is not motivated by expectation of survival, but by recognition of worth. God is obeyed not because he saves, but because he is God. This is the collapse of idolatry at its root. Judgment here is not arbitrary. I agree with the speaker because valuation has consequences. Belshazzar assigns God a value of 0, and in response, his own worth collapses. The moral order is not suspended. It is enforced. What a society treats as negligible will eventually treat it the same way. This discourse reveals a single coherent thesis. Civilizations do not fall because they abandon values, but because they exchange true absolutes for false ones. When God is relativized, power becomes sacred. When truth is negotiable, obedience is enforced. Daniel's resistance is not defiance, but clarity. He understands that survival without truth is not life, and unity without conscience is not peace. The choice presented is timeless: worship what is ultimate, or be ruled by what is merely powerful. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.